It really is a tremendous honor to be the one to introduce to you Stephen Dettelbach, the Director of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. After growing up in Cleveland, he graduated from Dartmouth and Harvard Law School and clerked for Judge Stanley Sporkin of the U.S. District Court in Washington, which launched his very distinguished career in public service. He joined the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice in 1992. He was detailed by the DOJ to the Senate Judiciary Committee shortly after the 9/11 attacks, and he served that committee for 2 years. He served as Assistant U.S. Attorney in Maryland and Ohio and was appointed and confirmed as U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Ohio, Cleveland, where he served from 2009 to 2016. While there, his priority was enforcement of civil rights violations, with a particular emphasis on the prosecution of hate crimes. All of this prepared him very well for his current assignment. He was nominated by President Biden in April of this year, and in July of this year, he became the first confirmed director of the ATF since 2015. It's a tremendous honor for us to have with us Director Stephen Dettelbach.
All right, good morning to everybody. A little louder because it's early, we got to pep up a little bit. Good morning to everybody. All right, I want to thank you first of all for that incredibly kind introduction and the commercial for the Browns. And I want to thank especially Laura Ellsworth and Mark Nordenberg for their leadership, not just in putting together this summit, but for their work in leading a community to bring together something out of a tragedy, something that can be positive, something that we can use to move forward on this important issue. The idea of this summit, eradicating hate, is truly more important now than it has ever been. In so many ways, I think people feel, at least I feel, like our country is at an inflection point. We have endless possibilities. Yet we have increasing violence and polarization. 30 years ago, I would have never believed that I would have at my fingertips, in my hands, access to much of the sum total of human knowledge and science, 24/7, 365, right at my fingertips. But if you had also told me 30 years ago that I'd be speaking at a conference less than 2 hours from where I grew up, that was spurred by a horrible mass shooting at a nearby synagogue, I would have also not believed that. So we find ourselves in a place where we have more and more tools than ever, but we seem to face greater challenges than ever. And sadly, sometimes the two are related. I hope that here today I can share a little bit of my perspectives on things that are happening and what I've seen in that seeming contradiction. So I'm here today proudly as the presidentially appointed Senate-confirmed director of ATF. But I'm also here as a husband, as a father, as an American, as a former civil rights attorney, and a proud member of the Jewish community. So these aspects, these different parts of who I am, of my identity, American, ATF director, Jew, dad, spouse, they're inseparable. And they work together, of course, to all make up the person that you see here before you. A guy who cherishes his own independence and now has to walk around with protection. A person who loves and cherishes his religion and the freedom of religion, but had to drop his children off for many years at a Jewish day school with an armed police officer. So which part of me is speaking to you here today? All of me, all of them. So as I said, we've certainly gotten to a point where we face very serious threats, current threats from violent extremism and hate crime. And that's nothing new, but things I think are not moving in the right direction. At ATF and before, I've seen what seems to be like a more brazen, a more violent, a more outward problem of hate-filled violence. And I do think that these are things that we have to confront and acknowledge. That problem, the reality of that problem, is something that is not going to go away by itself. It's something that sadly has been part of the undercurrent in our nation for many years. And I've seen over the years and over the decades that it ebbs and flows. Well, unfortunately, we're at a point now where things are not moving in the right direction. For ATF also, this is nothing new. ATF's mission is to protect the American people against violence. And I want to say a couple words here and talk to you about how ATF fits into helping to meet the challenge of violent extremism and hate crime in our nation today. So ATF's mission, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, is pretty simple. As I said, it's to protect people from violence in the United States. And to sort of put it in colloquial terms, because we deal with arsons, explosives, and gun violence, if it burns, if it bangs, or if it booms, ATF owns it. We're there to try and help our partners in state and local and federal law enforcement stop it. And for each of these three areas, I want to try to give you a concrete example of things that have happened and use that as a way to talk about some of the tools that we are bringing in the Department of Justice, in the federal government, and specifically at ATF to bear on this problem. And the takeaway I want you to have from this are things that I think you already understand but need to be repeated. This is a real problem, and ATF is all in helping it. So let me start first with if it burns. So ATF has responsibility and expertise in investigating arson cases. And arson cases come in all different flavors, but one of them I want to tell you about that left an impression on me was something that happened back in 2012 when I was the United States Attorney for the Northern District of Ohio. It's a case involving a guy named Randolph Lynn. Now, Randolph Lynn was a long-haul trucker. He was a veteran, and on the way back to his home in Indiana, he took I-75 often, and that would take him through northwest Ohio, and you could see from the freeway, and he could see the Islamic Center of Greater Toledo, which is a landmark building, a gorgeous building, and the largest mosque in Ohio. Evidently, unfortunately, this made the wrong kind of impression on Mr. Lynn. And one night, in his home in Indiana, he got hopped up on cable news and cheap beer, and he decided he was going to do something about it. So he got in his car, and he took with him a firearm, and he took accelerant, gasoline, with him, and he went to the mosque in Toledo. And we're lucky that it wasn't a mass shooting, because people had left the mosque for a large community meeting just moments, about 10 minutes before he got there. The last people had cleared out after lingering and talking to their friends. So it was almost empty when he went through with the gun and the accelerant, and he didn't find anybody. But carrying a loaded firearm and a can or cans of gasoline walking through the mosque, you can only imagine that if he had encountered people, there would have been no outcome except for him to act to try and kill them. Instead, he torched the mosque. And in so doing, not only caused the mosque to have to cease operations for many months, but damaged an entire community. That's what he intended to do. But what he didn't know he would do is he would also inspire so many others to act in a way that brought resilience, that brought unity to that community. And that should be a very familiar story here in Pittsburgh, right? Because in the wake of tragedy, you too have come together as a community to try and make something good out of it. But my experience in doing that, the impression it left on me was a meeting that I had with that community. I went to briefed them on how the case was going. They were victims and survivors of the case, and one of the things you do in law enforcement is you talk to the victims about how things are progressing through the court system. But what I didn't realize, and what I realized when I was pulling up to the location where we were meeting, is that even 6 months, 7 months later, I was pulling up to a Holiday Inn. And I asked, well, why are we going here? And they said, well, the mosque is still closed. And you don't think about these things. But that night I did. I met with the community, and I met with them in a conference room, a large gathering room, not quite this big, but pretty big. There were hundreds of people there. And I asked about whether this was something special for me, and they said, no, this is where we worship. And that made me very angry. Made me very angry, because in 2012 and 2013, in the United States of America, we had this group, hundreds of people, who were forced to exercise one of the most important freedoms that we have in this country in a Holiday Inn. Night after night, week after week, that was the only place that they had to go. And it really brought home for me how these crimes impact not just the people who are directly affected, but whole communities. But it also inspired me, because in their eyes and in their remarks that night, you could see there wasn't an ounce of give up in that whole community. They were ready for the next step, and not only they were, but the entire community, Christian, Jew, everybody in the community came together with the Islamic community in Toledo to send that message. So that's an incredible inspirational message, but it also needs to be followed by a strategy, right? What we do in federal law enforcement isn't just count on the resilience of survivors and victims. We have to come up with plans. And so one of the tried and true plans to deal with this kind of hate crime and extremism, really any crime, is the idea of working together more closely, banding together in task forces. And that's what, by the way, historically, a thing that ATF has done in just this area. In the 1990s, ATF was part of the National Church Arson Task Force, which was a strategy for dealing with a surge in arsons largely focused on African American houses of worship at that time. And ATF was there then, and we're there now. Now, and by the way, this is not an isolated problem, in 2021, ATF investigated 95 fires at houses of worship in this nation, 45 of which were intentionally set. Almost one a week. Just fires, just in houses of worship. But ATF is now part of the new domestic terrorism task force that the Attorney General has recently announced. So again, ATF will bring that expertise in responding to arsons and working with our law enforcement partners to try and address this problem using a tried and true law enforcement strategy. So that's a little bit about burning. Let me talk about things that boom, explosives, and what ATF does in that space. The best example I can think of to make that point to you is the World Trade Center bombing. Now, not the recent World Trade Center destruction in 2001, but the first one. In 1993, many of you, I'm sure, will remember that the World Trade Center was bombed in an act of hate-filled terror. And again, ATF was there as part of the response. In fact, I don't know how many people here would know this, but ATF recovery team, the ATF agent who was going through the rubble there that day, the ATF employee, was the person who recovered the key piece of evidence, the VIN number, or the identifying number on the vehicle that was used to try to destroy the World Trade Centers. And that's what ATF does in part in that space. ATF has something called the National Response Team, and it's really the world-leading response team to acts of explosive violence. They go from places like the World Trade Center to the bombing that many of you may have read about in Nashville. Time after time, ATF is there to try and piece through the physical and emotional rubble and put together some case that helps victims and brings justice. And so we'll bring that as well, along with our other investigative skills, to the Domestic Terrorism Task Force. And last, I want to say a word about things that go bang. And I say things that go bang. What I'm talking about is gun violence in the United States today. And I wouldn't be doing my job as ATF director if I didn't tell you that every day I am more concerned about the gun violence that ordinary Americans are facing in the United States. And I don't need to say that here in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, because you felt it, but I need to say it everywhere I go. This is an urgent situation. It is not what we should be doing. Every day in the United States of America, whether or not it's a mass shooting, over 100 people are taken, their lives are taken due to firearms violence. Every day. You don't read about it always in the paper, but it is a drumbeat that is totally unacceptable. And as director of the ATF, that's the number one thing, if you leave here with anything that I want to leave you with, is that ATF doesn't accept this as something that is appropriate or normal in our country, and neither should you. This is a problem that we cannot allow to be part of what we just think is the normal way of living in the freest society in the United States. And we have to work together every day in the law enforcement community and with you as leaders in the community to think of innovative ways to try and stem this tide of gun violence that has been growing for years and years and years, and we now see at a pace that should concern us all. Now, I will talk about one case briefly that made an impression on me, because I don't have to tell you this, but this gun violence does often overlap, intersect with the hate crime that you see. You know, whether it's just down the street here in Pittsburgh, or whether it's in Buffalo, or whether it's in a 4th of July parade outside of Chicago. All too often we have seen that individuals are committing these acts of hate and terror using guns. I want to tell you about one case that we were able to prevent from happening, and this, of course, comes again from my time as U.S. Attorney. It's a guy named Richard Schmidt. And Richard Schmidt lived in Northwest Ohio, and he was a convicted killer. He had been in prison for homicide. He had shot 3 people and I think killed one of them, and was a manslaughter convict and was out in jail. He's, by any law, by any interpretation, somebody that everybody agrees is not allowed to legally possess firearms. Yet the Joint Terrorism Task Force in the Northern District of Ohio, ATF is a member of that, FBI of course, discovered that he had literally an arsenal. And I don't say it as an arsenal, some sort of descriptive term. He had rented a space in a mall, boarded it up, and he literally had stocked it and set it up as an arsenal. Not just 1 or 2 firearms, but 14 or 15 firearms, including assault weapons, 40,000 rounds of ammunition, tactical gear, Kevlar, bulletproof vests, and most terrifying of all, notebooks and materials that indicated that he had been conducting surveillance up the road on the Jewish Community Federation in Detroit and on the local NAACP. So he was fixing to do something. And through the use of our intelligence, through the use of our task force, law enforcement was able to arrest him and prosecute him for illegally possessing those guns before he acted again. And I want to just say a word about what lessons that case and other cases give you about the new tools that ATF is able to bring to the gun violence issue. In law enforcement, we call it crime-gun intelligence. But what I'd like you to sort of understand about it is, through science, through lab work, we can now get more and more evidence out of every part of a crime gun when we examine it. We can get evidence that comes from the inside of the gun and from the outside of the gun, right? From the inside of the gun, you get distinctive markings that are on the bullet. You know about that, right? From watching television and understanding just reading the newspaper. Ballistics. But we can get things from the outside of the gun, like DNA, touch DNA. And we can get evidence of serial numbers on the gun, now that they have to have serial numbers and the regulation that we put on ghost guns is vitally important for law enforcement. I hear about this all over the country. The necessity of being able to trace firearms once they're used in crimes is a vital part of our ability to catch bad guys. And also things that come out the front of the gun and the back of the gun. So through something called NIBIN and through microscopy, we are now able to actually match spent cartridge casings, the cartridge casings that are ejected from the back of a firearm often, to match it with other crime scenes that gun may have been used at. And this is a game changer for law enforcement. So we bring this new ability to try and track crime guns, to try and track criminals and identify the worst of the worst before they act again. And so, yes, there are extreme challenges we're facing, but there are new tools as well. So, just last week on September 15th, the Department of Justice launched its nationwide United Against Hate initiative. And this is an initiative that will be sponsored through United States Attorney's offices. In the Middle District of Pennsylvania, by the way, right near here, is one of the 16 offices that are in the first cohort of offices who are going to be addressed with this forum, this idea. Local forums are going to be convened, just like this one, to work with law enforcement to build these alliances that you're building today. Working on defining and explaining what hate crimes are. Working on the importance of reporting hate crimes, which organizations like the ADL have been on the forefront of pushing day in and day out, year in and year out, all over this country. And then, most importantly, understanding how to respond to these crimes. And these alliances, these meetings, not just among people who are like-minded, but among people who think in other issues differently, are so important. It's so important to increase understanding, because I truly believe that it is harder to hate up close. Now, these are all, I've gone through some things that people in law enforcement and maybe law enforcement geeks like me get excited about. But in the end, if we're really going to eradicate hate, the key is not going to come from our government. Of course, it's going to come from within our hearts. I've seen great reserves of resilience here in Pittsburgh, but in other places. And that gives me hope. Things like this summit give me hope. Things like your willingness year after year to come together to discuss how we can end hate is a prime example of that resilience. The idea that out of tragedy, we can bring the best and brightest minds together to try and find creative solutions is a truly American proposition, and one that I hope we export to the entire world. The idea of bringing disparate people together to discuss how to resolve a problem, again, something that gives me great hope. So I can honestly say that the strength and resilience of people like you here today and watching is and always will be the first and most important defense against hate-filled violence. And the idea of what you're creating here, the idea of community, is so very important. It's truly the heart of what makes this nation and people like you all over the world great. Being a part of a community means that we do more than live near each other. At our best, we have to truly live with each other. Being part of a community means that we don't just tolerate each other, it means that we celebrate each other and all our differences. Being part of a community means we don't just share space with each other, we actually allow ourselves to be vulnerable and we depend on each other. And whether we're in law enforcement or whether we're in the private sector or whether we do other things, coming together for this purpose in community, when we can truly live together and work together and be together in this way, we really do come closer to fulfilling the title of this conference, Eradicating Hate. So thank you for doing this, and you have my thanks and my pledge that ATF is all in and wants to be a partner in your efforts to try and push back on the things that have happened, which show us that while hate is alive and well, and damaging our communities, there are more of us than there are of them, and that if we come together and work together and live together in the right way, someday maybe we will really be able to eradicate hate. Thanks. Now, while I still have the podium for a second, I get to give out a well-deserved and very important award. This is the ATF Director's Award. It recognizes outstanding and exceptionally significant service in the public interest. It is ATF's highest award for external individuals and organizations who have provided exceptional cooperation and superior support to ATF's mission, protecting the people from violent crime. I'm here to award ATF's Director's Award to Scott Schubert, Chief of Police, former Chief of Police for the City of Pittsburgh Bureau of Police. Is the Chief here somewhere? Chief? Chief? I'm going to make the Chief stand here for a second, and the Chief is not a big grandstander, so, but sorry, you have to hear this. With 29 years of law enforcement to his credit, Chief Schubert is a veteran officer and seasoned leader, and he truly has been one of ATF Pittsburgh's most valuable partners for many years. Just yesterday, I actually sat down with the command staff at the Pittsburgh Police Department, and what is going on there, what you built there, is truly incredible. It is a credit to this community and a credit to law enforcement. His commitment to the safety of Pittsburgh residents and ongoing support led to a variety. You can't even go through all the cases and all the enforcement actions that he is responsible for with the great people who he led at the Pittsburgh Police Department. He has partnered with ATF to address firearms-related violent crime. He has been a leader in not one, but two collaborative task forces, as well as nationally serving on ATF's National Crime Gun Intelligence Governing Board. Those things I told you about, the technology that are truly game changers, Chief Schubert has been a national leader in making sure that state and local law enforcement both helps design and utilize these kinds of tools. His constant dedication to providing insightful training and mentorship to future law enforcement leaders is evident. He has always been a participant in ATF's Leadership Institute. The Chief's longstanding working relationship with ATF at both the local and national level have truly made a difference for this country. The Pittsburgh Field Office, Philadelphia Field Division, and the ATF as a whole, and the Director of ATF, we want to tell you, Chief, we appreciate your leadership, your mentorship, and your partnership. Thank you, Chief Schubert, for your incredible contribution.